1st, 2018 afternoon session of the Portland City Council. Sue, please call the roll.
Fritz.
Here.
Fish.
Here.
Saltzman.
Here.
Udaly.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here. And now a message from our sponsor.
Welcome to the Portland City Council. The City Council represents all Portlanders and meets to do the city's business. The presiding officer preserves order and decorum during City Council meetings so that everyone can feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe. To participate in a City Council meeting, you may sign up in advance with the Council Clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or the first readings of ordinances. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary, and please disclose if you are a lobbyist. If you are representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of the testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When you have 30 seconds left, a yellow light goes on. When your time is done, a red light goes on. If you are in the audience and would like to show your support for something that is said, please feel free to do a thumbs up. If you want to express that you do not support something, please feel free to do a thumbs down. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting or interrupting testimony or council deliberations, will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being ejected for the remainder of the meeting. After being ejected, a person who fails to leave the meeting is subject to arrest for trespass. Thank you for helping your fellow Portlanders feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe.
Very good, thank you. Sue, would you please read the first two items, 284 and 285?
Item 284, amend the transportation system plan consistent with the 2035 comprehensive plan and in compliance with the regional transportation plan. Amend River District Master Street Plan. Add proposals for automated vehicles. Adopt findings of compliance, adopt corrections, amend transportation and parking demand management code to clarify requirements. And 285, amend the transportation system plan to update introduction, modal plans, implementation strategies, and glossary.
Very good. Commissioner Saltzman.
Thank you, Mayor. Excuse me. I'm pleased to introduce the hearing for the third and final stage of the update to Portland's 2035 Transportation System Plan, or TSP. The TSP is the 20-year guide for how we maintain and expand our transportation system to accommodate future growth. This update comes at a particularly important time as our population is growing and we continue to experience strong job growth. With new people and new economic activity, there comes increasing demands on our transportation system. At the same time, we are seeing new technologies and new mobility options which offer new opportunities as well as new challenges. All of this highlights the need for the city policies and strategies to guide our transportation decisions both today and in the years to come. Transportation touches so many aspects of our city, and the development of the TSP reflects this. With input from community members and business groups, and coordination with bureaus like Fire and Parks and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, the TSP has been comprehensively developed to be a guiding document for our city. And I'd now like to introduce Courtney Duke with PBOT to provide us with an overview of the third stage of the Transportation System Plan. She'll be joined by some others.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner Saltzman. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Courtney Duke from the Bureau of Transportation. I've been the project manager and lead of the Transportation System Plan and the city's comprehensive plan for transportation for the last 8 to 10 years, depending upon where you want to measure that. I'm here with Bob Kellett, a planner in our group, and Peter Hurley, another planner, to go through where we are right now for the Stage 3 TSP. So Bob's going to run the presentation, which should be up. Oh, there it is. Okay. So again, we also wanted to introduce most of the TSP team is here, those of you are still working with us. They're here to answer questions, but also to be recognized as working quite hard on this project as well, because we do think that this might be one of the last times we see you related to the TSP this round. Again, the TSP is a part of a larger transportation and land use plan process that goes all the way up to the state. I know that 3 of you have been here for the duration of our comp plan and TSP update, but we have 2 new commissioners, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioner Udaley. So we thought we'd do a little bit of background to make sure that we know where we all are. So again, our first slide just sort of gives an idea of how we fit in to the statewide planning goals, the transportation planning rule, which was a direction from the state to help implement those goals. We have a regional transportation plan that is actually underway right now, and actually both of the people here at the table with me are working on that as well. And then again, we're a part of the comprehensive plan. There are also components, and most of what you're going to see today are components that are outside of that comprehensive plan component, but we also have some changes to that, and then we have some things that we just need to update to have one cohesive document. So components of the transportation system plan you can see on this slide. Pretty big document. Right now it's in about 4 big binders, but again, we have some staff here later that are going to give some previews of how that's going to be streamlined into a more web document. So we'll go to the next slide to talk about where we have come to you before. So stage 1 of the TSP was a part of the comprehensive plan update that you saw as a part of the city's periodic review order that came down from the state. There were a number of tasks that were required by us, and we worked closely with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability and Eric Engstrom, who's also here. So what's highlighted were the things that were adopted by City Council in June of 2016. So those were the main goals and policies for transportation, which is Chapter 9, but there's also goals and policies related to transportation and the right-of-way in Chapters 2, which is the public involvement chapter, Chapter 3, 4, 8, and then of course Chapter 9 is the main component, but we have sections throughout. We also had the transportation major projects and programs, and then we had a project evaluation to get to that, and then a financial plan to help pay for all of that. And those, again, were required as a part of the state periodic review and were adopted by council in 2016, and I believe have just been upheld by the state, even though parts of it were appealed, but we were happy to say that no transportation-related things were appealed. And then we had stage 2, which is in the orangish color on your screen, I hope. So then we did some updates related to the introduction, because it was a fairly static document at that time, and the glossary, again, to be in compliance with the updated comprehensive plan. We made some changes to our community involvement chapter and to the bicycle objectives to be in alignment with the bicycle plan that had been adopted in 2010. And we made some adjustments to our street classification policies. There's 7 policies related to street classifications, and we updated the bicycle ones to be in compliance with the plan, as well as our street design classifications. And this was in direct response to changes to the comprehensive plan related to the centers and corridor strategy. We also updated our refinement plans and studies chapter because we had done a lot of those plans and studies. And then we also had some updates to our master street plans. And we made some changes to the street vacation code and have added that to the code as a part of that. We made some changes to transportation demand management and some commercial parking in the codes. Again, those were adopted in December of 16 and are at the state and have been approved at the state level. So now we are in stage 3, our final stage, which is in green. So we're making some additional changes to the introduction and glossary. Just since the last couple of years, there's been a few terms that we wanted to make sure that were included. We have actually deleted the objectives, and Bob's going to talk a little bit about this more when he talks, to be in compliance with the comprehensive plan and the 2035 Central City Plan. We made changes to street classifications for transit, emergency response, and traffic. We needed to do a minor update to the River District. We have a reference to our modal and management plans. We have some implementation strategies, especially related to codes and standards. And then we made some policy changes related to automated vehicles and our performance measures, partly in relation to some direction from Planning Commission. So then we also, as a part of all that, obviously had public participation. The discussion draft, we had a discussion and proposed draft, as we've done for all of our components. We had, as you can see, over 120 comments and outreached over 30 events. And we heard some from our West Hills citizens as well as some folks in Southeast, and we made some changes in the document related to that, which we'll talk about. And then the proposed draft came out, and we had sent out additional public involvement and had comments around that as well as Planning Commission testimony. All right, so today's council actions are an ordinance to update the comprehensive plan components. So those are the geographic policies, again, the objectives, street classifications, performance measures, the connected and automated vehicles, master street plan, some code chapter changes, some errata, which are basically some typos. And then we have a resolution related to the introduction, the modal plans, the glossary, and implementation strategies. And then now Bob and Peter will go through a little more detail on those sections.
Thank you, Courtney. As Courtney mentioned, a lot of what we've done has been working in conjunction with the comprehensive plan. So back in our current TSP that was written in 2007, we had a geographic policy that was based on the 7 districts. As you may know, with the comprehensive plan, they've adopted a 5 pattern area. So we've taken our geographic policies and made those into the pattern areas. With the objectives, in the 2007 TSP, we had goals, policies, and underneath those were objectives. To maintain consistency with the comprehensive plan and Central City 2035, which do not have objectives, we went through all the objectives. Some of them we achieved, and so we were able to delete those. Some were elevated to sub-policies, and then some we identified as being more of an implementation strategy, so we moved those to our implementation section. As Courtney mentioned, this stage 3, we've updated some of our street classifications. These provide policy guidance for the desired function of the street, so how we want the street to function. In this stage, we've updated the traffic, transit, and emergency response street classifications. In the stage 2, we did the bicycle and street design. And coming to you in the future will be our pedestrian classifications. That's right now part of the PDX master plan that is being updated, as well as potentially a freight master plan update sometime in the near future. So the street classifications, we've made some changes to emphasize our policies around Vision Zero to make sure that we have safety goals as our top priority. We've also clarified that some of the traffic calming tools that we can use, we've used on local streets, and now we can use on neighborhood collectors, things like speed bumps. With the transit, we worked closely with TriMet. As you may know, TriMet does a service enhancement planning where they're projecting out future transit service, and so we worked closely with them to update our transit street classifications, as well as emphasize not only the lines that will be serving us in the future, but also access to transit. We know how important it is for people to be able to get safely to their bus stops. And also, once they're on the bus, we have some policies related to priority treatments along those transit lines so that transit can move quicker where it needs to go. We worked closely with the Fire and Rescue Bureau on the emergency response street classifications. One of the big changes we've made is add a secondary response classification. So this is important when a primary response route is blocked for whatever reason, traffic, or it's closed for construction. The secondary emergency routes allow the fire and rescue to get where they're going. We've worked closely with them to identify ways in which we can have both our priorities of quick response, but also traffic calming. So we've worked with the Fire Bureau to develop fire-friendly speed bumps and things like that. We have worked closely with Prosper Portland on the post office site, so we've added a little bit of connectivity to the River District Master Street Plan to facilitate that redevelopment in the future. And as Courtney mentioned, we continue to make some updates to what we're calling the supporting sections, the introduction, the glossary. The modal master plans is a reference to the master plans that we have adopted, the bike master plan, pedestrian plan, and the implementation strategies. We did make one recommended change to Code Chapter 17.107. As part of Stage 2, Council adopted this in the commercial mixed-use zones for the transportation parking and demand management. So we're just clarifying within the code that the fees that will be charged are going to be part of an annual fee. This allows us also to look at ways in which we can have one rate for market rate dwellings and one for affordable rate. With TriMet adopting a new low-income fare, this might provide an opportunity to achieve both our transit goals and also our affordable housing goals. And now Peter will talk about performance measures.
Good afternoon, council members. Peter Hurley, Portland Bureau of Transportation. Section 7 of the document covers performance measures. Transportation system plans are required to have performance measures, and measures in our plan are the North Star for what we want to achieve on safety, on equity, on climate, and on congestion. PBOT, along with the Planning and Sustainability Commission, are recommending performance measures that will require strong actions to achieve. Achieving those measures will be a significant stretch. Council adopted several measures in December 2016. The changes before you today are refinements that emphasize a 70% non-single occupant vehicle mode share for all trips and for commute trips. We also make explicit a 30% or less target for commute trips and establish a new work at home target of 10%. We're also suggesting adding a new congestion target of not increasing the total number of non-freight trips, which is particularly important for addressing congestion.
May I please ask a question about this? So is the 10% work at home target, is that for the City of Portland, capital City of Portland, or is that for all of the City of Portland?
Very good question. It is for all employers in the City of Portland, so it would include private sector as well as public sector.
Okay, so when you say performance measure, because obviously you don't drive that decision. I mean, there's employment policies and everything else. And you say this is a performance measure. Is it a performance measure for PBOT or a performance measure for the program? Whose performance measure is this?
We're saying, and as part of a transportation system plan, the region and the state say set performance targets so that we can manage the system as a whole. We're establishing that as a city target in order to effectively manage the system as a whole. We do have some tools to work with both public sector and private sector employers, incentive programs, even improving transit, improving bicycle and pedestrian connections, helps people to make that choice. And as Bob just mentioned, we do have a transportation demand management program as well, where we work with both developers and employers to encourage people to use alternative modes, including working at home.
And I'm sorry, what is the current percentage?
I believe it's about, so it's just over 7%.
It's over 7%.
That one is not a huge stretch to get up to 10%.
No, it doesn't seem like it would be. And with, you know, our age-friendly city desires, obviously, we're trying to be more flexible in the workday and how people do work, and that could have obviously encouraged some older adults to stay engaged in the workforce as well. So that just caught my attention, and I appreciate your clarification.
You bet.
Commissioner Fritz?
Well, I think there's certainly an opportunity for us as a city employing 6,000 people. Obviously, the parks technicians need to be in the parks, but some of the staff could work from home 1 or 2 days a week, and that's something we can do by leadership. I also am kind of concerned that we're not proposing to improve our walking, bicycle, or transit percentages, and why is that?
So the percentages that were established by the council in December 2016, such as 25% for transit and 25% for bicycling, are very aggressive measures and will require a significant set of both policy and investment decisions in order to achieve those. The current projections are less than that we would not achieve those without significant policy changes and investment changes.
But we're going to keep them the same in stage 2 and stage 3 just to keep reaching for the top? Is that the
I think one of the things, we had some conversation at the Planning and Sustainability Commission, and Commissioner Smith can perhaps speak to this, but certainly what the message that we heard and the message that we wanted to send is that we believe that establishing realistically aggressive targets or significant stretch targets sends the appropriate message, given the adoptions that we have for Vision Zero, for our climate action plan, for our equity standards within the city, helping people to make it easier for them to travel affordably, to travel using transit, walking, and bicycling. It's appropriate to have those significant measures. And it does, in many ways, if if actions follow words, we'll be bringing to you a series of decisions that could up those percentages, but will be significant decisions.
Okay, thank you.
What is the, how do you define the 10% or the 12.5% of carpool? Is that of trips that are taken as part of a carpool, or 12.5% of what?
So that if there were 100 commute trips that were taken by individuals within the city, 12 and a half, yeah, of the total number of individuals would have chosen carpooling. So 25 out of 200, et cetera. And carpooling, there's the traditional carpooling, which is individuals choosing to share a ride to get to work. But it can also include the new technologies, so a shared TNC trip, a shared Uber Lyft trip, for example, could count as a carpool. Not if it's just the driver and one passenger. It would require 2 or more passengers as well. And one of the reasons that even though carpooling has been stagnant or declining over the last several years, because of the increase in access to transportation network company trips, Uber, Lyft, and others, we are seeing a significant increase in people using those options. And we would like to see more of those in the future shared, and those would count as carpool trips.
Great, great, thank you. I mean, that seems like one of the obvious solutions to reducing congestion that costs a lot less than infrastructure.
As we move into the automated and connected vehicle policy, one of the things that we are recommending along with the Planning and Sustainability Commission is that we take actions to advance shared trips. If we have a lot of zero occupant and single occupant trips, we are not going to achieve our targets.
Can I ask a question? Because you mentioned TNCs and they're not part of this. So if we have TNCs operating without a cap, and in my neighborhood, the streets are absolutely clogged with TNCs, how do we actually make progress on our goals here if we're not somehow cross-referencing the impact that they are having on congestion?
And Commissioner, if you will, the next section is actually the automated and connected vehicle policy, and I believe as I go through that, I can speak specifically to your question.
Okay.
When you talked to me yesterday, you pointed out that you count those in single occupancy vehicles.
Yes, and zero occupancy vehicles, and if they are not shared. So the next section, Section 8 of the TSP, establishes a new connected and automated vehicle policy. It's important to recognize we currently do not have one, and therefore one of the reasons that we're proposing one is to get ahead of the changes which are occurring. On Monday, a pedestrian crossing a road was killed by an Uber self-driving vehicle in Tempe, Arizona. That death reinforces the need for Portland to adopt a strong connected and automated vehicle policy with a clear priority on Vision Zero.
Could I ask you a question about that? Because that obviously got global press. There was actually a driver behind the wheel, was there not?
Yes, that's
and
the
they didn't
reporting
stop
that I've
either.
read.
So what else do we know about that? That's 3 days old now.
So I've read a number of reports. I'm probably not the best person to be commenting on it, but I think perhaps where a question in my mind, and perhaps in yours as well, is would it have made any difference?
That's my question.
If it were a driverless vehicle. We do know that there are nearly 40,000 people killed a year in the United States.
Right, but to be clear, it was not a driverless vehicle. It was reported as being a driverless vehicle.
It was being
It
driven
was an automated vehicle with a driver
guy
in the
sitting
seat.
behind the wheel.
Correct.
Perhaps not paying as much attention as he should have been.
Well, and that's part of the question.
Yes. And so one of the things that because we are prioritizing Vision Zero as part of the automated and connected vehicle policy, and because we are prioritizing a phased approach, testing first before deployment, one of the big questions that we have is how to assure a safe level of operation in the city. Obviously, the existing conditions are fairly dangerous, particularly for vulnerable road users because of the high level of death and injury that we currently experience. As we move to a new set of technologies, We want to make certain that those are safe for the full range.
So haven't we,
users.
I mean, I think we're once again at risk of putting the cart before the horse. Because when you say that, it sort of sounds like, well, we're going to test to see whether drag racing up Burnside makes sense in NASCAR vehicles. I think we first have to ask whether we want NASCAR vehicles on our streets. So I've raised this a dozen times every time we have this conversation, and what I don't want us to do is back into a policy without the council saying that we're going to green light the policy. And the council has not yet taken a position on connected and automated vehicles, and you're already talking about testing. So what have I missed?
So as part of the Smart Automated Vehicles Initiative, we have been prioritizing a very slow, step-by-step approach that involves, because there are already, at this point in time, there are no rules that the city of Portland has that would prevent an automated vehicle company from coming in and operating on our streets. By putting in place a strong policy that says, here is how we would like the or here is how you would need to operate within the city of Portland, starting with a testing approach, we're getting ahead of the technology and preventing the type of problems we could have if we didn't have
But why don't we just adopt a policy, an interim policy that says that we prohibit this activity, and then we figure out the rules? Right. Why are we backing into this?
I couldn't help but jump in. So Art Pierce, I manage transportation planning here for the Bureau. What we're having a discussion of today, specifically what you're talking about, is the recommendations for policy 9.6, which is articulating how autonomous vehicles will fit into our modal hierarchy, not authorizing their function in the street. So what you're specifically talking about, and we're emphasizing very specifically, if I go to the next slide, is when we are considering the inclusion of autonomous vehicles, how do we prioritize their inclusion versus other modes? So we're explicitly saying that walking and biking and transit are more prioritized than the inclusion of the autonomous vehicles. And that is very explicitly trying to address the importance of people-first modes and those modes that address our overall mobility and health strategies as the place to begin the conversation.
Well, that's helpful for me, Art. But again, and I'm agnostic on the outcome. What I'm simply saying is the council can't start adopting policies without first making a choice and making an informed choice at the front end. And what we're at risk of doing is piecemeal putting in place a regulatory structure that sort of says, well, this is inevitable, versus the threshold conversation about A, do we want this to occur in our city? B, under what rules? C, what are we going to prioritize in terms of funding? Because this comes with a big price tag in terms of building out a grid that we have to maintain, and could come at the expense of other transportation investments. And I just want to be sure that we don't sort of piecemeal get into a position where we say, oh, you know, the train's left the station, we've got all this in works. Because I think council first has to tackle the threshold question.
Sure, and I don't believe that what's in front of you today is that is the train leaving the station. It is instead trying to place where autonomous vehicles will fit into our overall transportation strategy. Okay. We do have the Smart Autonomous Vehicle Initiative that did come before council, where you gave us direction to not authorize the operation of autonomous vehicles before coming back to council. And so that's very explicit direction. That is not changed.
That's very helpful.
Yeah, so this is really trying to make sure, and I think we will be one of the first cities, if not the first city in the country, to place autonomous vehicles within the overall transportation strategy for a city. So this is actually, we think this is actually very aggressive policy first perspective.
Commissioner Fritz?
So are you asking us today to accept the policies in Section 8 on connected and autonomous vehicles?
Correct.
Automated vehicles, okay.
Yeah.
So when you get to the end of your presentation, I have a couple of amendments.
We knew you would, yes.
Thank you.
So I have one more question. I'll just put it on the table.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to this. This is hearsay and speculation. Right. I'm told that some Teslas already have the capacity to drive down the street with the driver behind the wheel, but they already have the capacity to do what the car in Phoenix was doing. Am I wrong?
Not quite what the car in Phoenix can do. Okay. So they have the ability for some level of disengagement from the driver. The vehicle in Phoenix was actually doing its entire trip in an automated mode.
Got it, okay,
Right.
thank you.
Yep.
I vaguely remember a Tesla going under a truck.
Yeah,
Under similar
there was a previous
circumstances.
fatality that was a Tesla driver, I think, thinking more of what their vehicle could do than it was capable of, yeah.
Yeah, reading a magazine or
I
something.
think so,
Right,
exactly. Or
okay,
taking a
thanks.
nap or something, yeah. Yeah, okay.
And as we move to the connected and automated vehicle policy, I think the concerns that you've expressed are ones that we share, and it's a primary reason that we are putting forward a policy at this point in time is we want to have a strong basis that council feels comfortable with, saying that you're prioritizing Vision Zero and other components so that we are prepared. On Monday, as I mentioned, Portland's policy and our Smart Automated Vehicle Initiative both strongly mandate a phased approach, starting with testing in controlled environments such as Portland International Raceway. We're also concerned that without strong standards, we could experience more congestion from zero-occupant AV trips. That's why the policy and SAVI prioritize fleet automated vehicles that are electric, shared, also known as FAVES, the acronym Fleet Automated Vehicles that are electric and shared. Which gets at the question you had previously asked Commissioner about congestion and the potential for congestion. One of the policy components here is to say that we are prioritizing or giving direction to the city to prioritize fleet automated vehicles that are electric and shared. We believe that could reduce parking demand and parking impacts, as well as to decrease the number of vehicles and therefore congestion.
By the way, do you happen to know whether any insurance companies are underwriting policies for automated vehicles?
So insurance is one of the areas that the state task force that was established by a bill that was just passed in the legislature is going to be looking into. I don't know whether the current vehicles on the road are self-insured by the companies that are testing them or are independently insured. And then finally, in the last slide, as Art alluded to a moment ago, the policy includes an update to the people-moving strategy adopted by the council in December 2016. We feel that this is particularly important because while we're maintaining walking, bicycling, and transit as the top priorities, we're also saying that amongst the passenger-carrying vehicle options, that fleet automated vehicles that are electric and shared are a top priority for affordability, for congestion, and for our climate goals, the electric component. So we're proposing to amend, along with the Planning and Sustainability Commission, to amend the people-moving strategy to reflect that prioritization. That's all that I have on connected and automated vehicles.
Okay. Should I introduce my amendments now? Or wait?
I think I'd wait. Is that okay? All right, thanks. Okay, so Bob and Peter are going to step back until there's more questions, and we're going to bring up Nicholas Wise, who's a consultant with us, and Kevin Donahue. I'm going to move over so you guys can get there. And Kevin Donahue is an associate planner with us. They are working together on a digital document for us, and also we'll be having a written document with everything included. So we want to just give a quick preview to show you what it will look like and some of the components. This is very much supposed to be a public-facing document and make it much easier for people to use. As I mentioned before, at least the one on my desk is 4 notebooks full of printed documentation, and so many of our folks aren't doing that anymore. So anyway, so Nicholas is here from Nicholas Wise and Kevin Donahue.
Welcome, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Like Courtney said, my name is Nicholas Wise. I'm a consultant with the Portland Bureau of Transportation from my own independent practice called Department. This is the digital web document of the Portland Transportation System Plan. Our main focus with this project was to make it more egalitarian and more open and accessible to the broader public, both private citizens who are concerned about the street construction in their neighborhood, or bicyclist advocates, or even specialist interests like developer groups who need to have a clear understanding of what the city's policy is to do things.
Oh, you're good.
So this is that gigantic document that exists on a desk but just on the internet. And this gives us a lot of things that we can do, which includes disseminating the document as downloads, as well as creating a easily searchable index of the entire document. So we can do a thing like search for live demos are always a joy and a pleasure. The entire document is searchable, so we can find results throughout the entire document that are apropos to interests. And then the other thing about the document is it is tying the textual adopted plan to all of the GIS data in the city. And we think this is really important because it makes it more accessible for people who are saying, yes, I can read about all these plans, I know what they mean, but what's happening on my street, what's happening around the corner? So here we're gonna zoom into DECOM, and we have all of the transportation system projects and programs, which Kevin can talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, the programs are in different phases right now. PDX is being updated, and there'll be project list that comes out of those. So as the data becomes available, we'll make those different programs selectable.
For example, here we have the bikeway network completion and the neighborhood greenways plans for this neighborhood. We also have the street classifications, so we can see the bicycle, transit, or design classifications. And then we can cross-reference these across each other by saying, let's look at the bicycle plan versus the neighborhood greenways. So they're composable. We also have a selection of reference layers, for example, zoning codes and project plan centers and corridors.
Can I ask you, which map are you using? I've noticed there's some subtle differences in different maps that you can access. Portland map, Google map, actually some surprising differences when you drill down. What are you using on this?
The base map that we're putting this data upon, I believe, is the base map provided by the portlandmaps.com. I believe that is the case. If it's not, we're using a standard base map issued by Esri, the GIS service provider. I'm pretty sure we're using the Portland Maps one, though. And as for the geographic data, we are rendering all of these plans from the Portland Bureau of Transportation's own GIS.
Thank you.
Okay. We just want to give you a quick preview of that. Thank you both. Okay, so the next steps, I think Bob's going to get us there, but I'll go ahead and go. So today we have our council hearing. On April 11th, if council needs any deliberations related to TSP, that would be on April 11th. On May 9th, we would have any council amendments or substitutions, again, if needed or proposed. On May 24th, we'd have a final reading and vote. And and then we'd have an effective date of June 25th. If there are no changes or deliberations needed, you could propose to have a first reading today and then your second and final reading on May 24th. So again, the requested council action, to just refresh your memory of all the things we just talked about. And then I just wanted to acknowledge the TSP team that's been working on this. Some of us for a long time, some of us just joined the team this week. Anyway, so some of them are here today, again, if they have questions, but everyone's worked really hard to make this a great document, and we, again, will continue to work on it as we move through any amendments and then through the final document in this summer. So we're open to questions. I also wanted to just make sure Commissioner Chris Smith from the Planning and Sustainability Commission is here to testify. I think he got signed up second rather than first, but he's here on behalf of the Planning Commission. And again, we have staff here to answer any questions you may have.
Chris, for the record, as the city attorney was reading that statement of admonishment, I think you were the only member of the public in the room at the time, so hope you don't take offense at that.
So before Chris speaks, I'd like to pass out my amendment.
Okay.
So these are hastily prepared amendments, and I'm glad to hear that we might get another shot at it in a couple of weeks. But this is in Section 8 of the plan, the recommended plan that we've been given, which is on connected and autonomous vehicles. It might be helpful to turn to that because I didn't have time to write out what else is there. So it's 8.1. Unfortunately, the document is it's in sections rather than with numbers. So if you
We're getting there.
Yeah. So if you turn to page 8.1 of your document. So I share Commissioner Fish's concerns. In fact, Commissioner, I've pretty much made a very, well, I would like to say it was a similar speech since it was the end of last Wednesday. I was a bit fried, so I would say it was more of a rant than your very careful and measured speech with concerns about autonomous vehicles. There was a discussion at the Metro Policy Advisory Committee meeting that I was frankly appalled by because there was the kind of gleeful assumption that everybody would be using autonomous vehicles where previously we've been trying to get folks, especially in some of the outlying jurisdictions, onto transit and indeed to provide transit. So I'm very concerned that Metro's jurisdictions are going to embrace automated vehicles and therefore adding a huge number of single vehicles. We know that there were 9 million Uber and Lyft trips last year in Portland, which is ridiculous, a huge number, and it's no wonder that transit is going down. So knowing the challenges that we have had with the transportation network companies, I want to make sure that we have policies in place that make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. So for policy 9X, capital A, lowercase a, which states in the draft, ensure all levels of automated vehicles advance Vision Zero by operating safely for all users, especially for vulnerable road users. I will add a second sentence, ensure adequate insurance coverage for operators, customers, and the public at large by providers of autonomous vehicles. And I would also state, just in reference to the discussion on the tragedy in Arizona, that vehicle was speeding. And so I would like to see a policy that automated vehicles are not allowed to speed, that they are set for the speed limit maximum. But that's, I think, included in the first sentence. The second addition would be in the following policy, which is in this, it's 9X, capital A, lowercase b, about ensure that connected and automated vehicles improve travel time reliability and system efficiency. There are set 3 existing policies, and I would like to add supporting and encouraging use of public transportation. It was explained to me by the Metro planner that they are hoping that they could use autonomous vehicles to get people from their home to the transit station or bus stop rather than all the way in a single occupancy vehicle from point A to point B. And so if these kinds of technologies are going to be used to augment and support the public transit system, that's a good thing. If they're going to compete with it, that's a bad thing. And I think we need to state that very clearly in the policy. And then my final correction for right now is on the next page, under policy X9, capital A, lowercase d, which is make the benefits of automated mobility available on an equitable basis. Long sentence that continues. And then I would like to add, this includes people with disabilities as well as communities of colour, women, and geographically underserved communities. I think we could also actually add non-English speaking people, that we want to make sure that we know that people have not shared equally in the transportation network companies because there's a lot of people who can't afford to use them and they haven't helped with transit provision or anything else that would make the whole system more equitable. So those are the 3 of the things that I think are the most urgent for us to add to this policy.
Are you offering this as a package?
Yes.
Second.
So Commissioner Fritz moves amendments to Section 8 under connected and autonomous vehicles per the document we all have, and Commissioner Fish seconds the package.
And now that's on the table, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Smith, and what I'm sure is a pleasant change of pace for all of us, I am not going to harangue you about freeways today. I am here in my capacity as Vice Chair of the Planning and Sustainability Commission to convey the PSC recommendation. We've had the opportunity to journey through all 3 stages of the TSP with Courtney and the PBOT team, and I'd like to thank the staff for that whole process. It's been great from my point of view and appreciate their support through the process. Let me say, first of all, that the PSC endorses TSP Stage 3 and encourages you to adopt it. I want to spend a minute talking about AVs and some other next steps that the PSC would urge Council and PBOT to take. Yeah, AVs are an interesting opportunity and challenge at the same time. You know, as you've heard, there's the potential that AVs increase the amount of vehicle miles traveled in Portland. On the other hand, we think it could significantly reduce parking demand, which would be a good thing. And also at the end point of the revolution, and obviously we are on a path, they should be much safer than human drivers. I mean, yes, there was a tragedy in Tempe, but you know, that shouldn't distract from the fact that human drivers killed 50 Portlanders on our streets last year. There is a point where AVs should be much safer, and I look forward to that endpoint. Now, we may not be there yet. The statistical evidence has multiple interpretations. But I think the bigger policy challenge that we face is what kind of AV future we have. Mayor, you helped kick off the Urbanism Next conference last week, which I attended. Very much a painting of two pictures there, a heaven and a hell for AVs. And I believe the policy that PBOT has included in TSP Stage 3 is very much pushing us towards the heaven scenario, but it will take some heavy lifting to get there. I mean, the worst case you could imagine is a privately owned AV that follows you around through the day, and every time you get out to do something, just circles waiting to pick you up again, right? That would be horrendous. The PBOT policy wisely points towards shared fleets, so there will be AVs out there that we all share and use rather than owning them individually. But it will take, I'm sure, inducements from government to get us down that path. I think you should also be careful that it might be tempting to say we won't let AVs operate on the streets of Portland until some set of criteria are met, but you should probably be prepared for the possibility that the federal or state government will preempt that choice from you, and having policy that we can sustain and enforce to back that up would be an important thing. A couple of other points. I want to echo what Commissioner Fritsch said, because we made a recommendation that the city should, in fact, through leadership, demonstrate how to be an employer that supports telecommuting. I have been on that journey myself for as long as I've lived in the city. My employer has been in Wilsonville, and for many years I reverse commuted down to Wilsonville. And in 2000, I became a part-time telecommuter, and since then the curve has slowly increased until last year I finally gave up my desk in Wilsonville and work entirely from my home in Portland. It's eminently possible in today's technology environment to do that and still be an effective member of a team, and I think the city should be out in front showing other employers how to make that happen. I think we can have a much greater than 10% work from home share, and we should aspire to do that, and the city should be out leading the charge. The PSC made two other specific recommendations for follow-on actions. One is to take that mode share chart that PBOT displayed and actually turn that into an action plan and have PBOT seek resources and make plans to cause those modal shifts to change, including setting 5 and 10-year interim goals, not just a goal out in 2035, but to say what the steps are along the way that we will get there. I think if we are not very intentional about this, congestion will continue to be a big challenge for Portland, and we're going to have to marshal our resources to stay ahead of that challenge. The other specific recommendation the PSC made was for the city to develop its own transit plan for the city. And this is not intended in any way to be a replacement for the good work that TriMet does, but rather an assistance to that. We've already started in this direction with things like the Enhanced Transit Corridors program. We can work best in partnership with TriMet when we understand our needs the most, and transit is a sufficiently important part of our mobility future that we should have a very well-articulated set of goals for the city, and our own transit plan would go a long way towards doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I have a question. You came all the way, so thanks for joining us. Last time I was in D.C., Chris, the lead story in the Washington Post was that there was a bipartisan effort to consider preemption. And what was interesting when I read it was that the Democrats were even more enthusiastic than the Republicans because of their connections to Silicon Valley and the idea of technology. So I think it's very helpful for you to signal that could be coming down I won't say down the road. I wanted to ask your opinion on something, though. You know, I've watched the film Sully about 10 times, and my takeaway from that film is that all the advances in technology in the cockpit of an airplane, plus an experienced pilot, gives us even a greater chance of having safety. That the combination is a winning combination. And in that film, at least the moral of that film is, if you took Sully out of the cockpit, the plane would have crashed, because the technology would have made a couple of assumptions that turned out not to be true when they did the flight simulation. So if what we want is safety as a paramount virtue, why not require in autonomous vehicles that there still be an operator? Isn't that getting the best of both worlds?
So I'm thinking about all the market forces that will militate against that. And I think there's also, you know, what an autonomous vehicle does is give you your time back, right? You are no longer spending your time looking out the windshield, making sure you don't hit a pedestrian. You're checking your email or you're doing work. So, you know, the people who travel will want to take advantage of that time. So that's the countervailing force, right? And I think it's an extraordinarily powerful one. And I think you potentially get the best of both worlds. Sully doesn't have to be in the cockpit. He could be at a joystick 1,000 miles away, connected by the internet to that plane, and perhaps provide the same judgment, right? And I think we will see with level 4 AVs, there will probably be human remote operators that can intervene in certain situations. So the technology is going to evolve in a lot of ways, but I am way more confident of a robot with great infrared vision seeing me on a dark street at night on my bicycle than I am of a human operator seeing me in that same situation, or even to be able to detect the Bluetooth ping from my cell phone, which no human operator will ever perceive. So there's a lot of opportunity to introduce safety technology. Sure, a human is a backup, probably always a plus, although the thing that scares me the most about the level 3 testing, which is the stage we're in now, where a human operator is supposed to be able to intervene when needed, is the ability of a human to react and take over control fast enough to have a meaningful impact. And I think, you know, that will be a question in the Tempe situation. So,
let me ask you a follow-up question. One of the issues that you constantly raise to us is about equity and how we distribute our resources. What do we know about the cost that the city would have to incur in order for the grid to be smart enough to accommodate AV, and does that work against some of our equity goals in terms of providing transportation infrastructure for parts of the city that lag?
So there are probably people in Peabody who can answer that better than I can, but I will say, you know, for my part, it is not yet clear to me where the city's value add will be in terms of, you know, vehicle-to-vehicle communications or vehicle-to-wayside communications, whether that whole set of functionality can be provided over the cellular networks, in which case it may be the private entities that bear most of the cost, and the city might be a data provider to a network. Whether or not we'll actually install wayside infrastructure for this or not is not clear to me. There are probably people in PBOT who have a better opinion or more informed opinion than I do. What I would say is that as we regulate, and we clearly will regulate, and you know, to be forthright, pricing will be a big part of that regulation. There will be revenue and expense streams that we ought to carefully tailor to advance our equity goals.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I just want to add that there are some of us who can't read while driving or in the car that get motion sick. And I think that if you took a survey of people and asked whether they'd prefer to be the driver or the passenger, there's a lot of Americans who would much prefer to be the driver. So that has to be factored into how this is or isn't useful.
Well, and it will be a long time before we outlaw human drivers, and the system is going to have to be smart enough to accommodate human drivers mixed with automated vehicles, which has its own challenges. So things like platooning, where 3 automated vehicles can be a foot apart and use less room on the freeway, you know, will be interrupted by the human drivers who are still out there, and we have to figure all that out.
The future.
Indeed.
We're living it.
All right, does that complete your?
That completes us, yes.
Okay, and Sue, is that all the people we had signed up?
We have one other speaker.
Very good.
Terry Parker, please come up.
Yes, Mr. Parker, come on up, please.
Terry Parker, Northeast Portland. I really haven't had a chance to say anything about this transportation service system plan to the council. Transportation system plan is a mirror image of the turbulence and upheaval created by the Trump administration. The car hater mindset in which it was conceived generates bitterness, hostility, and aggression between the various transport mode users. You only need to look at the clash over Lincoln Street in Southeast Portland to get a picture of the animosity. The city has a PBOT self-inflicted congestion problem. Road diets create more congestion, which in turn adds to fuel consumption and emissions. Enhanced transit corridor options that take away through travel lanes or add curb extensions will do the same. This TSP will only make congestion worse, causing even more confrontations. It doesn't make sense to create a target for congestion and then create more of it. Build more housing. More people move in and come with their cars. With self-driving cars on the horizon and transport options like Lyft and Uber already here, universal transit service may very well become an expensive dinosaur. Younger generations who traditionally ride bicycles and now want to raise their families are transitioning to cars and SUVs. Additional motor vehicle capacity is needed, not less. This must include fixing I-5 at the Rose Quarter, but without tolls. Instead of sanctioning environmental mafia tactics, extorting motorists, and attempting to dictate mode choice, possibly even discriminating as it applies to income, the city needs to establish equity by requiring alternative mode users, including freeloading bicyclists, to pay their fair share for the specific and specialized bicycle infrastructure they utilize. Modes at the top of the privilege hierarchy need to pay more than those at the bottom. Additionally, if the city expects people to transition from petroleum-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, the city needs to require adequate off-street parking for all new residential development that includes adjacent electric connectivity for overnight charging. This is far better than running extension cords across sidewalks or down the block to cars stored on the street. Finally, the political leadership here and elsewhere needs to start talking about the real issue associated with both the creation of congestion and maintaining the sustainability of the planet, that being continued population growth. The TSP needs some changes that reflects a reality that cars are not going away. And two additional things, any SOV targets must also apply to the city's fleet of cars, which are almost exclusively used as SOV vehicles. And I can't read what my other thought was. I apologize. I had another thought about automated vehicles, but I wrote it so. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, and Terry, we have your written testimony as well here, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks for
I
coming.
think that's a really interesting point about electric vehicles and having to have somewhere for them to recharge if we want to encourage that.
I think so, but if you're not going to supply parking, where are they going to recharge them? You know, I mean, they need a place to plug them in, and so you need a parking space for at least most residences.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
Very good. And that concludes both 284 and 285 as far as your presentation. Yeah. Colleagues, any further
questions? This is the first time in recorded history that someone has asked for a 1 hour for an item that's as complicated as this. And by my watch and the clock, we have just come in under 1 hour. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It's an inspiration for the rest of us.
Okay, thanks.
Indeed it is. So item number 284, this is the first reading of a non-emergency ordinance. I'm sorry. We need to actually vote on Commissioner Fritz's amendments first.
Or what I was going to propose is if we could have that conversation at the April 11th deliberations, because I think we would like to read them and just make sure we understand them and where they would go and have conversation.
There may well be some refinement that you would like to suggest. Right,
and then that's why we had the April 11th time set aside.
Okay, and those are for the amendments are those to 285 or to 284?
The ordinance, which is 284. But we would like to keep it as a package.
So what we will do then is we'll move it to second reading.
Yeah.
and we'll keep the amendments open, and we'll have the opportunity to vote on the amendments at the second reading. Does that work for you, Commissioner Fritz?
Yeah.
Very good. So done.
Thank you.
With regard to 285, that is a resolution.
I think you said you want it as a
We'd
package.
like to keep
You
them
want to
together.
keep them both
Yeah,
together?
please.
Okay, we will continue then item number 285, and they'll
And what was,
remain joint.
can you remind the date and time certain that you're continuing it to?
We're April 11th, and I don't know the time certain.
And that time is 3:30 p.m.
3:30.
Thank you.
April 11th, 3:30, Portland City Hall. Be there.
And I don't know if we need to say it, but I believe that written testimony is open until 5 o'clock on Friday.
This Friday?
Yeah, the 23rd.
Very good.
Yeah.
So written testimony will remain open until this Friday, which is March 23rd.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, thank you.
Nice
Thank
job.
you. All right, next item, please, 286 and 287. Please read those together.
Item 286, amend zoning regulations to implement the 2035 comprehensive plan through the Code Reconciliation Project.
Colleagues, sorry, Commissioner Fritz?
287
Sorry.
is amend tree, noise, and sign regulations to effectively implement Portland City Code through the Code Reconciliation Project.
I'm going to challenge you. on-
Colleagues, we're here today to be briefed by staff and hear public testimony on the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, the Code Reconciliation Project. The project amends Title 33, the zoning code, as well as Title 11, trees, Title 18, noise, Title 32, signs and related regulations. This is being presented to us as two ordinances, but it is in actuality just one project. We will hear public testimony today. On April 11th, the council will deliberate and vote on the amendments that were the subject of the public hearing today, which is March 21st. We have BPS staff, Eric Engstrom and Barry Manning, to come up and introduce the hearing.
Okay.
Welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler. Commissioners, my name is Eric Engstrom. I manage the comprehensive planning program at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you? And I'm sorry I'm not tracking as well as I should. It's been a long day. Sue, did you read all the way through?
I did.
She vanished. You read all the way through 291?
291.
No, that's tomorrow.
It's 286 and 287.
Oh, you're right, 286 and 287. Ignore me. Continue. Eric, welcome.
Thank you. With me is Barry Manning, who's been the project manager on this code reconciliation project. After I finish introducing, he'll go through some of the details before you take public testimony. Just a reminder of the context. This is the third of three projects that are moving through council this month to help tie up loose ends and ensure a successful implementation of the codes associated with the new comprehensive plan. You heard last week the map refinement project and had a hearing on that. Earlier, just a moment ago, you heard the transportation system plan, third phase. And today we're bringing you the zoning code and other city code elements that have been traveling along with these three projects. So this is primarily focused on code amendments that tie up those loose ends, which Barry will go over. All of these projects, just as a reminder, we're trying to orchestrate them so that you get them done and make a final vote on May 24th, which is the day that the new comprehensive plan goes into effect. Last week, we had good news from the State Land Conservation and Development Commission, which upheld the plan and rejected appeals against the plan. There's still a possibility for further appeals up to the Court of Appeals, but the LCDC action is certainly good news. So again, we're trying to make sure that all these different moving parts land on May 24th and can be voted on. It's important that you adopt the amendments to the new plan actually when the plan is in effect for a variety of reasons, and so that's why it's all aiming for that day. And just one reminder that this is different than the Central City Plan, which you're going to hear, but I think you have another hearing on tomorrow, so just to make that clear.
Can I ask you a question, Eric? So last time we had a hearing, we had a lot of folks who came and testified about very specific requests. A father-daughter that wanted had an issue with respect to a house they wanted to build. I and my colleagues put forth some amendments. All of that will be taken up on May 24th?
No, we're going to come back on, I think that was held over until April, was it 4th?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of this.
You held it over to a point of deliberation, which I think is in early April.
Yes.
And then you'll take your actions there in terms of amendments, and then it'll go to the final reading.
Okay, all right, and the second question I had is, if it's April 4th or whenever when we come back, are you going to bring us a cheat sheet on that day?
Yeah, or before. For the hearing you had last week, Marty Stockton, who's the project manager there, will be delivering a summary of the testimony with our recommendations for what you do with that.
Good.
And then we'll ask you to decide on which ones you want to take forward in terms of amendments. And that deliberation would occur on the 4th.
And we'll also vote on the amendments that members of the council have put forth.
Correct. Yeah, and so today I think we're looking at deliberation on the 11th for the same day as the project you just heard about. So Barry will describe the contents of what's in this package.
Great, thanks, Eric. Barry Manning, planning staff, project manager for the project, and thanks for hearing this afternoon. A little slower than I expected to be. So the Code Reconciliation Project is a large document. You've seen that, some 600 odd pages. And the purpose of it is really to reconcile zoning and other city codes with our newly adopted 2035 Comprehensive Plan Implementation Package, as Eric just mentioned, which takes place on effect on the 24th. And the reason we're doing this is, as many of you will recall, as part of the 2035 comp plan, we adopted new commercial mixed-use zones. There are all new zones that will go into effect into the commercial areas around town, outside of the central city. And so those zones need to line up with other code references within the zoning code. We also adopted new campus institutional zones that don't exist right now, and those will go into effect. We need to line the codes up with that. And then we did some amendments to employment and industrial zones, and there are some relationships in the code that that need to be addressed there as well. Again, we are cleaning up redundancies, fixing cross references, and fine-tuning. It's largely a technical package, but I would note that because the new zones, particularly the commercial mixed-use zones, are not direct replacements for the existing commercial zones, that we do have some situations where development allowances can change, and we have different things that are going on there because they're not direct replacements. We tried to keep it as technical as possible. Our working mode of operation was to try to maintain the regulations and the allowances to the extent possible while applying the new zones in the context. So again, why are we doing the project? A couple of other things happened at the end of 2016. The council adopted the inclusionary housing project as well as the comprehensive plan implementation code amendments at the same time, late in 2016. Those were, the comprehensive plan is a new set of codes that are going into effect in May, and the inclusionary housing was a set of regulations that applied on the existing zoning, and the two didn't quite meet up in terms of their how they would be structured in the code. So this package is trying to marry those two things as well. So we're taking the new codes, which didn't include inclusionary housing, they included some different forms of bonuses and incentives for affordable housing, and marry them to the inclusionary housing package so that it all works well together in the long run moving forward. So that's one of the key things. And then we're going to be, as this notes, the slide notes, we're going to be monitoring and making potential further calibration adjustments to inclusionary housing moving forward. That'll be brought back to council at a later date. This one right here is just implementing what we have on the books right now into the new code.
So I guess I just have to ask, given statements I made earlier this morning, you say adjustments to the inclusionary housing program if warranted. Who's deciding if warranted?
Yeah, I'd probably defer to Eric on that. I think that's a conversation the Bureau leadership and council are having.
Yeah, I think that both the Housing Bureau and BPS are working together to monitor what's happening under the new program, and ultimately council gets to decide if it's warranted. We're going to bring information about that eventually to council.
Okay. And again, this would be just implementing what we have on the books right now and moving forward with that. What's affected, as the mayor noted, we're amending Title 33. Most significantly, about 90% of what you have in front of you is zoning code amendments. But we are also amending Title 11, which is the tree title, Title 18, noise control, and Title 32, signs and related regulations. And the reason for that is all of those reference zoning designations within those titles. A few prior review bodies reviewed this work before it was presented to council today. The Planning and Sustainability Commission has purview over Title 33, Title 11, and Title 32, and they had a hearing and several work sessions on that before making their recommendations to you here today. The Urban Forestry Commission also has purview over Title 11, and we had several work sessions with them as well as a hearing with them before they made their recommendations. And we also presented to the Noise Review Board on Title 18 noise code amendments. So in terms of Title 33 amendments, we have multiple chapters that have minor technical corrections. Really, they're intended to provide consistency throughout the zoning code. And I'm going to recap some of the most significant amendments that might have effects on development or you might hear testimony about today. So in the multi-dwelling chapter of our zoning code, we're amending the chapter to conform with the inclusionary housing bonus approach. We are deleting the institutional residential IR zone, which is being moved to the campus institutional zones chapter, and we're amending some maps that designate the 4-to-1 FAR in the RH zone, and that's related to the map refinement project, which you heard about last week. In the new commercial mixed-use zones chapter, we are amending again the affordable housing bonus that exists now to be consistent with the IH approach, so we'll be implementing that with this. Projects that trigger IH or voluntarily comply would be allowed to utilize the maximum floor area ratios and height allowed through the bonuses, which was what was intended in the way the mixed-use zones were originally designed. We're also removing the reduced rent requirement from the affordable commercial bonus, which is still in the mixed-use zones, and specifying participation in a Prosper Portland program. I might make note of that in that Prosper Portland is working on administrative rules to implement the affordable commercial bonus. They're underway with that right now. They'll be returning to Planning and Sustainability Commission on the 27th of March for a briefing, and we expect the commission to probably send a follow-up letter to the council with their recommendations on that program as well. Another item of note is we're reestablishing design review for self-service storage uses in the commercial employment CE zone that was not included in the original package, and through conversations with other bureaus and stakeholders, it was determined that it was appropriate to apply design review in that zone as well as the other ones where that use is allowed. In the employment and industrial zones, again, we're amending to conform with the IH bonus approach, and we're changing setbacks for buildings and outdoor activities adjacent to residential zones in order to reduce impacts. These are linked to removal of the buffer overlay zone, which I think you had some testimony on and some discussion about at the map refinement project hearing. We'll talk about that more today, and I expect you'll probably hear testimony about that as well. We also have a memo that outlines some of the issues associated with that, and be happy to pass that out to the council. We've made it available to the public as well. In the campus institutional zones, we're essentially amending to conform to the IH approach again in the CI2 zone. A few more to go through here. There's a lot in this package. Self-service storage. We've had a significant amount of development in the self-service storage use category around town over the last 2 to 3 years. And there's been a significant amount of testimony that was expressed at Planning and Sustainability Commission about those facilities and their impacts on the pedestrian environment, particularly in Main Street and transit-oriented locations. As a result of the testimony and deliberations at the Planning and Sustainability Commission, we're updating those. Not only are we applying design guidelines that are specific to a particular design district if one is built in a design district. We are also updating the codes to require active uses at the ground floor when one of these facilities is built in a pedestrian or significantly transit-oriented location. And the idea here is that rather than having a completely inactive space at the ground floor that might include just storage units, we'd like to activate that space so that it better serves the community. So a portion of that ground floor area would need to be some kind of an active use, whether it was a retail use or maybe an office use or something else like that.
We can't just ban self-storage in the central city, additional self-storage.
Well, I won't speak to what can happen in the central city. You're going to be hearing about that, I think, in tomorrow's hearing. This is outside of the central city where these particular regulations would apply. So,
I see.
Yeah,
the
this is outside of.
Okay.
I should mention most of the codes that we're talking about today are applying outside of the central city. We're dealing with the central city regulations as part of Central City 2035 more exclusively. This one, there was some discussion about banning this use outright in locations outside of the central city, and ultimately this compromise was settled on as a mid-ground point.
Okay.
The buffer overlay, again, I think you'll hear testimony about that today, and you may have questions about it. We're applying new setback and landscaping standards in the employment and industrial zones. They are similar to what we did in the commercial mixed-use zones, which when we adopted the 2035 comp plan amendments, we applied new buffering type standards in the base zones and removed the buffer overlay on those commercial zones. We're taking the same approach with employment and industrial zones. And so we're applying those new base zones, removing the buffer overlay from the map and code.
Barry, I want to just, because this is likely to be the one thing you hear most about in testimony, I want to just stress this point that basically this deals with landscaping and setback standards where industrial and residential properties abut. And under the old code, we had a special overlay map that came with some sets of standards that governed that interaction. The problem with the old system is that it wasn't mapped consistently in all the places where those two zones touch each other. So we're eliminating that map, and instead we're putting similar standards in the basic text of the zoning code and eliminating that map. And you're going to hear testimony concerns about the elimination of that map, but I want to stress that we're not eliminating the concept that there should be landscaping or setbacks where those two zones touch. We're just structurally changing the way we accomplish that. One of the places where we've heard a lot of testimony is in the Willamette Heights neighborhood. And in that particular situation, we also have the presence of the environmental overlay, which is really a much stronger set of regulations that will have a bigger effect on the situation there, and we're not changing that regulation at all through this package.
Only a few more to go here. We are amending several plan districts throughout the city. Plan districts, as you may be aware, regulate development in specific areas of town that have a special character or have a plan adopted for them. Central City is an example of that. Outside of the Central City, there's a plan district in Hollywood, there's one in St. John's, there's one in Gateway, et cetera. And most of those plan districts were based on the old zoning framework, and whether they had bonuses for housing or other allowances, those were based on a framework that didn't include the calculation oftentimes of floor area in residential developments, and that has changed as part of the new zoning framework. We're now looking at floor area as part of residential developments and calculating the whole thing. So what we've done is gone through all those plan districts and try to update and have updated them to bring them into conformance with the new system, where there were zones that did not have an offset, for instance, for inclusionary housing, as the base zones do. We've included an offset for those inclusionary housing projects. Where a plan district may have had a bonus for housing, we've generally converted those bonuses to an inclusionary housing bonus. So if you meet the inclusionary housing, you're eligible for that housing bonus. And we've adjusted the floor area ratios to conform to the new system, and overall, we've maintained the height limits that were allowed in those plan districts. Most plan districts allowed more generous height limits than the base zones do. Some of them have reduced height limits, and we've maintained those throughout those. So we've really just adjusted the floor area ratios to adapt it to the IH program. There's a couple of other small changes within those plan districts. We've changed some retail size allowances to conform with the new employment and industrial zones. That's primarily in the Columbia Corridor area. We've amended references throughout, as we have throughout the code, to conform with the new commercial mixed-use zones, the C/MU. And we've revised maps to conform to recently adopted zoning or lot line changes that happened as part of that process. And those are the plan districts shown there where they're happening. So you can see they're kind of scattered all around town. The conditional use chapter, it's a large chapter, has several provisions for conditional use approvals. And throughout that chapter, we've amended it to reflect a citywide change in the way we looked at transportation approval criteria for similar types of reviews. It places a further emphasis on evaluation factors such as safety, and de-emphasizes level of service as one of the particular offsetting measures there. So, and evaluation measures is really looking to look towards a multimodal system in transportation evaluation criteria. And that's several chapters and sections within 33815. I mentioned Title 11 earlier. We are amending it to remove tree preservation and tree density exemptions that exist now that apply to the CS and CM zones. Those zones will no longer exist in the new zoning framework. They've been replaced by CM1, CM2, CM3, and CE. There aren't really direct replacement zones. CS and CM were one of or two zones of a group that allowed 100% lot coverage and did not require any landscaping, and that was one of the criteria for zones exemptions in the tree code, which would relieve them from tree preservation and tree density requirements. The new commercial mixed-use zones all require some degree of landscaping or an alternative to that landscaping. And in deliberations and discussions with the Urban Forestry Commission and the Planning and Sustainability Commission, we determined that just removing the references was the appropriate solution here, such that no zone would be exempt from the tree regulations, but the tree code still has a provision that if you have very dense development with lot coverages of 85% or greater, you have either exemptions or a reduced tree density requirement. So for very dense development, we still have some opportunity for exemption. Otherwise, we would need to look at trees in those. Title 32 signs reshuffles the way the zones apply to the new sign code, or to the existing sign code. I've summarized here to suggest that CM1 zones are assigned to the smaller sign allowances. CM2, which is the medium-sized commercial mixed-use zones, are assigned to the medium-sized allowances, so that equates to the existing CS and CM zones that you may be familiar with. CM3, which is the largest scale mixed-use zone, equates to larger size sign allowances. That's very similar to the EX zone that exists now. CR, which is the commercial residential zone, is applied in very limited situations in residential areas. And the CI1 zone, which is a campus institutional one zone, which is applied also in residential situations, would have standards that relate more to the residential zones because of the residential context of those zones' placement. The one thing I'd note here about the sign regulation is that the general commercial zone ended up being rezoned to several different zones in the comp plan process. It went to CE, commercial employment. Some of them went to CM2 or CM3. Some of them went to CM1. Depending on where your existing CG zone was located, you might have been assigned a different zone in the comprehensive plan, and that would have implications on the sign allowances for that zone. In the future, there might be some changes. Existing signs would be grandfathered. I think I've got two more slides and we'll wrap up here. Title 18, noise regulations. The proposal does not change the noise regulations at all. All it does is reassign the zones to the categories within the code. The most noteworthy of the reassignments are that the CM3 zone is assigned to a commercial use category. CM3 replaces EX, and EX had been assigned to an industrial use category noise level. So this is essentially a reduction in allowed noise to the CM3 zone compared to what the EX zone has now. And it also assigns CR and the CM1 zones to the residential use category, just as we had talked about in signs. So some issues you might hear about today in testimony. We've already talked about the buffer overlay. We may hear a little bit about self-service storage. Again, that was a new issue that came up out of Planning and Sustainability Commission. I mentioned the affordable commercial space bonus and the Planning and Sustainability Commission review of that. I don't expect that you'll hear testimony today, but we will be coming back with that at a later date with their recommendations if they have any further. We are creating an administrative rule for energy efficient buildings that would be applied in one of our existing bonuses. I don't expect to hear testimony on that, but you may hear some information about that over the coming months while you're deliberating on this. And again, tree, sign, and noise code, we may hear some testimony on that. We haven't heard a significant amount of testimony to date. So with that, I'll answer any questions you have.
Commissioner Daly.
In regards to the buffer removal, we heard hours of testimony. I'm in a time warp right now. Last week, the week before, at least a dozen of which were people concerned about this buffer overlay zone being changed or eliminated. So you're telling me that that is not going to change at all on the ground. It's just a map?
It's a strategy of how we're implementing the landscaping and setback standards in the code. In the case of the testimony you heard, most of which was from Willamette Heights, in that location, there's another zoning overlay, the environmental conservation zone, that has a much broader set of regulations that will serve to protect that existing hillside and govern the development there.
I guess I'm not quite done yet. I'm in favor of people coming here to testify for or against things we are actually doing. Having people take time out of their day and take time off work and extend these extraordinarily long meetings to testify against things that we actually aren't going to do is frustrating, and I'm just wondering where in the process did that miscommunication happen, or where was the missed opportunity for that neighborhood to actually get informed about what was really happening?
I think this is something that there's been some communication throughout the project, including at the Planning Commission level. I would say this is a sufficiently complex and thick package that there's room for misinterpretation,
yes.
And so we've tried to correct any misunderstandings about the effect. There is a code change, so I think the bottom line may be that people are just concerned that they don't know how it could change.
But shouldn't there be somewhere for them to get that information instead of coming to council to sign up to give testimony, which is not actually pertinent to what's going to happen?
Yes, and we've tried to provide information, and our planner, our district planning group, who is more daily engaged with folks who are calling in. We have a helpline that was published in the public notice, and we've had a lot of phone conversations.
I would love to help you promote that helpline through my office and through the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. I am both self-interested in this matter, but really, I don't want community members taking time out of their day and time off of work to come downtown and not having a meaningful experience. Thank you. I'm not criticizing anyone. I just wanted to know, it just seemed like they should have been able to get their questions answered.
Commissioner, I have not yet had my questions answered, so we're still pending a memo on that staff will be providing us before the next hearing, since we did have the testimony last time. We asked and were promised that we would get a side-by-side comparison of what's in the old code, what the protections will be now with the setbacks,
For the buffer overlay.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't...
But they have an environmental overlay, which
That was stated last week. However, there are other regulations in the buffer zones which this packet proposes to delete, and I'm not yet It could well be that I will be, but I don't have that information yet.
Okay. Oh, right.
If I can add to that, just to follow on.
Hopeless is basically.
So we're still in the process is the point.
We do have a memo that we'd like to share with council, so we can share that with you either now or later, maybe after testimony. We've made it available to the public so the folks have had an opportunity to look that over. And
why don't you pass it out?
Sure, we can pass that out right now.
Why didn't we get it? I've got it in my staff notes.
It's brand new.
We just
But
brought
while
it
you're
down today.
handing that out, Eric, can I ask you another question? Just to make sure I'm not missing something. So why don't you give it to Carla? Just give, I'm sorry, not Carla. Sue, excuse me, creature of habit. Eric, you mentioned you mentioned the affordable commercial space bonus, and I might have been out of the room when you talked about it. So can you just remind me, there's a lot of pieces here that we're taking up to address that issue. PDC is proposing to do some work because they actually own some commercial space, and they're also looking to, within urban renewal districts, provide some resources. There's a bunch of other things. Would you just remind me, and again, I'm sorry if you've already gone over this, could you give me like a quick primer on the affordable commercial space bonus?
Yeah, well, this came up during the rewrite of the commercial mixed-use zones, and we gave the biggest bonuses for inclusionary housing because that was the overall priority that everyone kind of agreed was the public good that we were trying to get out of bonuses. But we did include a bonus for commercial space. We call it the affordable commercial space bonus, and this was worked out because we got some testimony that it would be nice to have a clear path for small businesses, emerging businesses, minority businesses that have a harder time breaking into being in the ground floor of brand new buildings. And so when we have substantial redevelopment like we saw on Williams Avenue or on Division, that sometimes that completely changes the character of the retail environment because the smaller businesses really don't have access to that kind of development. And so we did a lot of work with Prosper Portland and other stakeholders to figure out if there was a viable way for us to give a small increment of additional entitlement in exchange for an affordable commercial program dedicated as part of the ground floor. And the general answer was we think something is viable, and so Prosper Portland had a process over last summer to dig into that and figure out what that kind of program would look like. And it is, you're right, they already do a form of this with buildings they're involved with in urban renewal districts. So it seemed like a natural extension of that to allow essentially to buy into that program or something similar to it through a bonus outside of urban renewal districts.
Right, and I'm sorry, maybe this is belaboring the obvious, but it does or does not compete with inclusionary zoning?
It is, we tried to make it not compete with inclusionary zoning by making inclusionary zoning the only avenue where you could get the full bonus. So this does not earn you the full bonus. So if you want to get the full bonus, you effectively still have to do inclusionary housing. But for commercial-only projects that maybe are not going to do housing, this would be one of the few ways to do a bonus that would have a direct community benefit on the ground.
And for which we'd give them a little extra height.
Exactly. So,
floor area. And floor area as well.
Right. So Prosper has been working on the detailed programmatic rules of how this would work, and they're presenting that to the Planning Commission later this month.
Okay, thank you.
If I can go back to the buffer overlay for just a moment, just to elaborate, I think I want to be clear that the standards in the new base zones are not direct replacements of what was in the buffer overlay. We tried to evaluate what was appropriate given what we had done in the commercial mixed-use zones and setting up buffers in those zones. And we looked towards that to emulate standards in the industrial and employment zones. They are kind of a blend between the buffer overlay, the existing zoning, and what we did in the commercial mixed-use zones. And we can go into more detail about that if you'd like to, maybe after other questions or maybe after testimony if you'd prefer.
Commissioner Fritz.
I think just from looking through this memo, I'm going to need a much more detailed explanation because it says here the buffer layer, I mean, one of the reasons to standardize it, as we discussed last time, but it says currently the widths range from 25 feet to over 300 feet. If we're exchanging a 300-foot buffer for a 10-foot buffer, I could understand why the neighborhood would be quite upset. So how are you going to walk us through that area by area?
It's tricky because it's very situational. On balance, we believe we've come up with a package that achieves the same intent, but on a case-by-case basis, you're right, there may be properties that didn't have any regulation of this topic before who are now subject to setbacks in landscaping, or conversely, there could be properties that under the old buffer overlay had a wider landscaping requirement than they will now. So,
Also, in particular, for Willamette Heights, since, as Commissioner Daly said, we did get such a lot of testimony on that.
Yeah, and in Willamette Heights, again, our analysis is that doesn't matter because it's really the environmental conservation zone that's going to have the controlling effect here.
I would beg to differ, having seen quite a number of environmental reviews where things have been allowed that I would prefer not to have been allowed. And it depends to me on what is their buffer zone now. What is the width of that in comparison with what is the width of their environmental zone? So I'd like some more details on that when we come back next time.
We'll come back with more for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We can give you more detail on that.
Thank you.
Very good. So that concludes your presentation on the staff amendments. Obviously, you would like a motion and a second to put those on the table. Is that correct?
Actually, Mayor Wheeler, I think we have an amendment package that we gave to you.
The March 21st memo.
Correct, yes. And
okay.
we haven't addressed that quite yet.
Okay, do you want to go through that unless anybody has any questions first?
Yes.
Okay, why don't we go through that because I know people are
And
patiently waiting to testify.
I don't think council has received this yet, so let me have Sue pass that out to you. Perfect. And you may have received it by email, but you don't have a hard copy.
Great, and I promise folks we'll get to the public testimony right after this piece.
So what is being referred to now for the benefit of the audience is the staff proposed a package of small additional amendments that are on top of the Planning Commission's recommendation. And
let's work through them quickly because
Sure.
They're not the audience, they're my employers.
Right,
And
I've got
keep them
two quick slides here. Most of these, again, are technical amendments clarifying things such as the types of pedestrian connections in the residential and the commercial mixed-use zone chapters to clarify that those are not public connections. There's some amendments to the drive-through allowances in the CE zone to talk about when a drive-through is considered discontinued. The ones that are highlighted on this sheet and the next sheet are the ones that are really the most significant. 33, 130, 292, it moves, there's a regulation in the commercial mixed-use zones for pedestrian connections on large sites. We've moved the location of that reference to the chapter that the section that I've indicated, 292, and we've elaborated on that to clarify it. So that's a fairly significant amendment. The upshot of it is that there's really no change in the intent of what was intended in the commercial mixed-use zones, but it's been rephrased. 33, 266, 110 is highlighted here. That's in our parking chapter. We are updating those parking regulations to be in the commercial mixed-use zones, the Task 5 project, to be consistent with what was adopted when the council adopted inclusionary housing. So we're making the future code consistent with the most recently adopted current code, if you follow my logic on that. So ultimately, that change is not significant. It's really implementing today's code there. I'm going to skip down to 33, 270, 200. We're clarifying that in the planned development bonus areas in commercial mixed-use zones that community design standards can be used for buildings that meet the allowable size and use limits. So buildings that are typically 55 feet or 5 stories or less in height can use community design standards. It wasn't clear that in this particular bonus one could use that, so we're clarifying that you can. On the second page, starting at chapter 420, really just correcting some code references. We're making some changes to maps in the Gateway Plan District and in the Laurelhurst Plan District to just correct some boundaries due to some zoning changes that happened in the comprehensive plan and map amendments. We're making a change in the Northwest Plan District to clarify that the maximum allowed floor area in a particular set of bonuses within that plan district is 3-to-1 overall. And the reason we're doing that is that the way the code had been written, again, it's one of those situations where it referenced the existing zones. with the new zones counting floor area differently. If we had left the code alone, we would have allowed much more floor area than was expected to be developed in that area, so this corrects that. Map 575-1 is again just a correction of a map title. 852 are a couple of code changes requested by PBOT. One is that it makes the application requirements for transportation demand management consistent with the approval criteria, so it reduces the burden on applicants to demonstrate that they've met or that they're meeting the criteria, and it corrects a code reference. And then finally, in our definition section in 33.910, we're amending the definition of floor area ratio to sync up that definition with the practical application of the way we measure that. And that was something that we discussed extensively with BDS to move forward.
Very good. So you would characterize most of these as being technical amendments, and they're brought to you in consultation with other bureaus, BDS, PBOT, et cetera.
Correct.
Very good. I move the technical amendments.
Second.
We have a motion and we have a second. We'll keep that open. All right, folks, public testimony time. So the public testimony that we're taking today is specific to the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, the Code Reconciliation Project, and any of today's amendments that you heard about. When you come up, it's helpful if you could let us know, if possible, about which city title and code provisions you're testifying about. If you don't know, that's fine, don't worry. But if you happen to know it, that's also helpful, just because it helps us hone in on the particular amendments that you're discussing. We always have a tradition here, if there are people with young children or people with disabilities or other needs who'd like to come up sooner rather than later, please let Sue know and she will accommodate you. And with that, we'll take the first three. How many do we have today?
We have 8.
Very good. 3 minutes, just name for the record. We don't need your specific address.
Will the first 3 come up, please? Silas Beebe, Stu Smucker, Sabina Wolfweiler, and they'll be followed by Sam Beebe, Allison Reynolds, and Shane Kwiatkowski. Quite?
Yeah, she got it. She got that.
Obviously not an unusual thing.
Is there a process for handouts?
Yeah, just hand them to Sue, and then she'll get them to all of us.
Big ones for Ted Wheeler.
My skull's a little thicker, so it's good they're a little thicker for me. Very good. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm here to discuss, I guess it's issue number 33. It's the 2425 Northwest St. Helens Road.
Could you give us your name, please?
I want to first state that
Could you give us your name, please?
My name is Silas Beebe.
Thank you.
First, wanted to say that Joan Frederickson, the West District Liaison for BPS, has been very helpful, and Steve Kuntz also, and they organized a meeting for the neighbors at Friendly House that I helped to organize, and it was very helpful and informational. And this latest memo that we just saw today would have been great to have at that meeting a month ago. We had the meeting in February, and it was a chance for neighbors to ask questions and learn about this issue. One of the things we learned was this chart that shows the differences between the current buffer overlay and the proposed. And with the removal of buffer overlay, the setbacks drop from 10 to 20 feet to as little as 0 feet from the rear lines and 5 feet from the side lines of a residence. That's a pretty big change. It also would allow, removing the buffer overlay would allow exterior work activities and exterior display and storage as little as 5 feet from residential homes. So we could have a billboard 5 feet from residential homes and exterior work activities like a lumber yard or things like that by removing the buffer overlay. Yes, there's a conservation overlay, but to the neighbors, it's little, it's not very reassuring that we're just an environmental review away from developing this land so closely adjacent to family homes. I went around the neighborhood and canvassed, knocked on doors, and quite quickly and easily got a petition that simply says, I'm a resident of Willamette Heights. I'm in favor of retaining the buffer B zone overlay on the property. 2425 north of St. Helens roads. So I got 6 pages filled up pretty quickly, and I could double that in short order because there's a lot of streets I didn't even hit. And by knocking on those doors, I also learned that a lot of neighbors along the perimeter, up on Thurman in particular, never received notice. They never actually learned that this was happening and had no idea. The handout I'm handing out is showing that there's 2 properties whose property directly abuts the southwestern corner of this lot, and both of those houses are condemned, abandoned, red tagged as uninhabitable because of landslides. And the stories, the news stories about this say that what actually happened was heavy rains reactivated an existing landslide. So what we're concerned about is we're just environmental review away from developing this site with a history of landslides, and then that provides a lot of benefit for the neighbors as a buffer between the industrial area. So we asked for an amendment, a easement, a conservation additional overlay, some kind of, if we don't have a chance to retain the buffer overlay, please ask for some other way to protect this site and keep it from being developed because we don't want.
Yeah, that's very compelling testimony, and I think you may have heard from our conversation up here that we were very sympathetic to that, and we're not making any decisions today. And so this is obviously going to continue to be a very live conversation for us. But I'll just say today, your testimony is very compelling. Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you. And thanks to Open Signal, I could see on the monitor that I don't have what you have there in terms of the comparing the old. So staff, can I get a copy of what he has? Do you know what he has? Yes, I'm seeing a nod. They're going to get it for me.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay.
I agree. That's what we need to see.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. Thanks for your patience. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Stu Spucker. I'm from Willamette Heights, and I'm here to testify about Title 33 and Title 32, which relates to signs. I own and live at a residential lot that borders the industrial lot at 2425 Northwest St. Helens Road. The draft recommendation of the BPS is to remove the buffer from that industrial lot, and I oppose that. BPS is recommending that sections 33.410.010 and .030 of the Portland Zoning Code be deleted. Those sections set forth the purpose of a buffer, how it is achieved, and where it is most important. It is to be used between non-residential and residential zones when the base zone standards do not provide adequate separation between residential and non-residential uses. The separation is achieved by restricting motor vehicle access, increasing setbacks, requiring additional landscaping, restricting signs, and in some cases by requiring additional information and proof of mitigation for uses that may cause off-site impacts and nuisances. It is to be applied primarily along the edge of a non-residential zone abutting a residential one. 11 of us own residential property along the edge of the industrial St. Helens property. It is my understanding that the buffer was originally placed on the St. Helens property because the city had determined that the base zone standards by themselves did not provide adequate separation between the industrial property and the residential neighbors. It is my understanding that this stemmed, at least in part, from hearings and testimony in 1991. Removing the buffer may provide greater consistency in citywide mapping, but it does not address the underlying reason that the buffer was placed on the property in the first place, or how, going forward, adequate separation is achieved. The BPS also recommends deleting or reducing development standards in what up to now has been buffer zones. The standards cover setbacks and landscaping, structures and exterior activities, motor vehicle access, and radio frequency transmission facilities. The BPS is also recommending deletion of the code section 33410.080 that makes a buffer zone subject to off-site impact regulations of 33.262. Under current code section 3234.020, signs are prohibited in the buffer overlay zone. BPS is recommending deletion of the sign prohibition. From the point of view of residential neighbors, these recommendations are not mere technical changes. The buffer in the city code sections regulating separation, development standards, motor vehicle access, off-site oversight, billboards, and radio frequency transmission towers were put in place for a reason. I submit that those reasons are just as important today as they were when the buffer was first placed on the property. I request that the buffer-related prohibitions on sign, motor vehicle access, and radio frequency towers be retained. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon.
Hi, my name is Sabina Wohlfeiler, and I've lived at 2125 Northwest 33rd Avenue since 1987. The last time I provided testimony before City Council was almost 30 years ago when Bud Clark was the mayor. And interestingly enough, that testimony was about the same issue and the same property, the buffer zone on 2425 Northwest St. Helens Road. I'm here today to make three requests of the members of the council. First, I ask you to become familiar with the extensive history of this property and its importance as the only separation between our residential zone and the industrial sanctuary below us. Second, I ask you to honor the hard work of your predecessors who in the late 80s and early 90s crafted a solution that has served all of us well for decades. And they worked hard. It was like a 3-year onslaught of meetings and everything. And third, I ask you to make an exception to the map refinement project and retain this buffer designation. I understand that Portland is changing, priorities shift and politicians change, but the geologic composition of this slope does not. Two geologists, Roger A. Redfern and John McDonald, have extensive documentation on file dating from October 24th, 1988 to November 22nd, 1989, in which they both agree, and here I'm quoting, "This site is geologically complex, the reasons being its geologic history, past landslides, and stream erosion." Bud Clark and his city council listened to us and voted to retain the buffer and put in place an environmental overlay as additional protection, and I understand you're keeping that. But this is a geologically unstable hillside and must not have vegetation removed or the toe of the hillside excavated, which was done back in those times. At 7 feet and 11 feet, there are layers of silt which turn to liquid during an earthquake. Our neighborhood has had extensive earthquake preparedness training sessions. Removing protection provided by this buffer puts us all in more jeopardy. Downgrading the zoning by removing the buffer classifications gives owners of property in the industrial sanctuary a distinct advantage over the needs of Willamette Heights residents for clean air, noise abatement, and visual separation from industry. I have a copy of that same thing that Silas has, and according to today's rules, new development and ground disturbance, there needs to be an environmental review within the resource area of the overlay. It calls for avoid, minimize, mitigate impacts to natural resources. The proposed plan, no requirements beyond setbacks. So we're losing out here. Nobody ever refers to the term residential sanctuary. It's always industrial sanctuary. Robert Putnam, who spoke at Portland City Club some years ago, wrote a book in 2003 called Better Together, Restoring the American Community. He devoted an entire chapter to Portland and our impressive civic involvement. The Portland of today is changing in many ways, but the ability to listen to the people should be retained. Thank you for listening.
Can I ask you a question? This is sort of a historic moment. It's 30 years since you've been here. I was doing the math on how many mayors since then and thinking, wow. Mayor Wheeler and I, the other day, were up in his office looking at some pictures of the old chambers and before the big renovation. I'm just curious, when you testified before Bud, how were we configured? Do you remember?
No, it's the other way.
They were sitting over there.
Yeah.
So the
When I
council
first
was
started
over
with this
there.
game, that's not that
You
long,
know,
Commissioner.
I was so nervous, I barely remember that.
Well, how do you like the upgrade?
It's lovely, it's lovely.
Yeah, they have the windows all blocked off too.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you made a really good point about community involvement. And it's people like you who have the capacity to come down on a Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock to highlight the issues with this site that perhaps are speaking for other sites whose neighbours are not able to pay as much attention. And so I'm certainly going to be asking staff, you know, what's the policy reason for removing the buffer? Is it, should we be looking at this citywide, and if maybe it's a different project? So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you for listening.
We appreciate your testimony, all of you. We'll see you in 30 years.
She might be back if we don't do what she asks.
Next three,
Next
please.
three, please.
Please come up. Sam Beebe, Allison Reynolds, and Shane.
All right. Welcome.
I think we have a quorum of the Beebe family here today.
We do. Good afternoon. My name is Sam Beebe. Thank you for hearing our testimony. And would like to talk about Title 33, give feedback on Title 33, and particularly oppose the removal of the buffer B. I'll speak quickly because I think my friends, family, and neighbors already pointed out the points, and as well as Commissioner Fritz. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Allison Reynolds. I'm here on behalf of Killian Pacific, and we're asking for a new amendment today to Title 33. It would be a change to map 120-7, which is the RH zone 4-to-1 mapping. And essentially what happened is that this is an alternative fix for a property that we are proposing that we tried to fix through the map refinement project. Talked with Marty Stockton after you guys considered those changes last week, and she suggested that we provide this testimony as sort of an alternative solution for this project. Killian owns a property at 2525 Northwest Lovejoy, and that property is currently improved with a 90,000 square foot, give or take, medical office building. And the site is currently zoned RH. We had previously, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, asked all the various boards that considered the comp plan to change that site zoning to make that office building a conforming use and a conforming development by either zoning it CM2 or CM3. That change was proposed as a CM1 change under the map refinement project. That would not actually cure either of those issues, and so we continued asking for the higher zoned CM options. The neighborhood also did not like the idea of rezoning that site from residential to another option. So today we are proposing to essentially let the use issue go and instead just deal with the size of the development. And as you probably know, under the code, the RH zoning has sort of 2 different FAR and heights that can apply. Certain areas are mapped for a 2-to-1 RH, where it's essentially a lower density RH version, and others are mapped at 4-to-1 FAR. It would make the development size on this current site conforming if we were to map it for 4-to-1 FAR and 75 feet in height. And so that's the change that we're asking for this property. Just leave it zoned RH, since that seemed to be what might work better here for the neighborhood interests, but still allow the size of the development that's built there to be allowed to be a conforming development through this change.
Thank you very much.
And
Appreciate it.
do you know if the neighborhood supports that request?
I actually do not know if they support that. I'm not sure that we realized that that was an option until I think last week, but we're hoping, since the development that's there is roughly the same size and it's currently medical office, we think that their main concerns were traffic, and we assume that if it were a residential development instead, that would probably include less traffic than's currently there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Hello, my name's Shane Kwiatkowski. This is the first time I've ever been in the room, so and so I don't know the specific name of the code, but there's an opportunity for different kinds of businesses to be able to be on the ground. What is it, PSC? What was that? You talked about it earlier.
Affordable commercial space bonus.
Awesome, great. I wanted to speak directly to that. First, just a little bit of context of my own experience. I don't currently live in Portland. I live in Vancouver. I used to live on Mississippi Avenue, but unfortunately I just got priced out. And so when I'm looking at the changes as far as national and international business investment, when it comes to Portland versus Vancouver, something that I think we're not diversifying nearly enough, and part of the gentrification aspect that we don't talk about is that many local companies do not pay good wages. Their wages have not increased for dozens, if not 20 or 30 years. And what I know as someone who's been raised here for 29 years is that it's very frustrating when you don't feel you have the same opportunity of the neighborhood or the local vibe. And it kind of gets to the point, which I'll now bring to an example. I worked at a bakery in North Portland, and it's a shop that says shop local, shop local, shop local. I developed anorexia in the 2 years following, and I lost 65 pounds because my baristas did not tip me. I made 300 or 400 loaves of cookies or whatever, but I was a minimum wage, and between the rent of my place and where I worked, I found it very disturbing that I became so food insecure. And I also was just right above the limit to get food stamps, right? So here I was living on Mississippi, seeing 900 units be developed in a year and a half with people whose incomes dwarf mine by 4 to 5 times. They get to enjoy the oyster bar, they get to enjoy the coffee, but how many people here do? So then that's context for why I think it's important. I know Pike Place, by the time I researched this in 2007 or 2009, they did a study that all state and federal funds for the development of Pike Place Market was met within 3 years. All the businesses within there achieved operating in the black, and the fish market that's on the corner, if you only measured the fiscal solvency of an organization, not compared to digital space, because digital space is not physical space, the ones that throw the fish, by 2009 they were grossing on average $45 million a year with an employment base of 43. If you know how to divide 45 by 43 equally, you know what that profit share is, right? And so I bring that up because I envision not rich cafeterias in Portland like the one on, it's like 4 blocks that way, I don't even know what to call it, but it's just, I think there are ways to make, even in the lobbies and the businesses of hotels and larger infrastructure, essentially that whole cafeteria style. If we focus on 10 to 20 foot or 40 foot square stalls of stuff with secured locks, and the overhead was only $50 to $75 a month, you might see a lot of people have been historically pushed out of Portland that directly make the craftsmanship and the entrepreneurial activities that draw investment here in the first place.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you. Next 3, please.
Jane Beebe, Richard Schwartz, and Paul Martin. Please come up.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's good
Welcome
to see
back.
you again.
Thank you.
Hello.
So you've heard Jane Beebe, and you've heard from a lot of Beebes. And I would just say that my son Silas said it all for me. I dumbly didn't understand when I signed it, that I was signing up to speak.
Happens to me all the time. Don't take it personally.
Yeah. So we just hope you.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
None of us knew what we
we
signed up
appreciate
for.
it. Thank you. Mr. Schwartz.
My name is Richard Schwartz. That's without a T in the last name. And I'm a resident of Willamette Heights on Northwest Vaughan. At the outset, have to say I apologize for being late to the party on this issue, but I've tried to get myself as much up to speed in the last 48 hours as possible. And after reviewing the testimony of the online of the people who spoke before me and those who are here today, I say I'm in firm belief in the positions they've taken in opposition to the elimination of the buffer zone. Many have spoken already about this, and I can appreciate the interests in the city and its applicable departments to bring some conformity to provisions of the code, which, by the way, is, I'm not fluent in building code. I'm less fluent than I am in French, and I don't even speak French. So But the issue to which I'm speaking, I believe, is 33.410.010 at sequential. But I'd like to reinforce the notion about the instability of the air, first on the conformance and then the issue, and then the environmental stability of the area with respect to landslides and land stability. I can appreciate the notion of conformance, but it's always surprised me that conformance seems to be to the lowest common denominator or the lowest level and rarely to the higher level. I'm not suggesting that the higher level is the optimal or the best, but it's concerning to me that the lower one, and you've heard earlier today about reduction of the setback standards from 10 to 0 feet, and we're talking about a residential area and abutting an industrial area. I heard in a testimony from staff that they were trying to, if I understood it correctly, trying to make some conformity between commercial standards for buffer areas and industrial, but I think there's a qualitative and substantial difference between commercial properties in neighborhoods or in or around neighborhoods and industrial areas. This part of Willamette Heights is above an area that's often cited in earthquake vulnerability studies. It's right above the strip of land that has most of the petroleum repositories subject to liquefaction, which is area which can affect our area as well, with 3 streams running through, previous landslides, houses that are red tagged now because of landslide vulnerability. And I think the removal of the buffer, while there's an assertion that the environmental overlay will, the suggestion was prevent expansion in that or development in that area. I see it as only a regulation for determined developers to overcome rather than the equivalent of a buffer. A buffer is a barrier. Environmental requirements are not necessarily a barrier and may be overcome by assertions and other tactics on a future basis. So those are my concerns, and I endorse and embrace wholeheartedly those comments of my neighbors who have spoken in opposition to this.
Very good. Thank you, sir. And for my colleagues, I want to acknowledge you, Richard, for your service as the Vice Chair of the Oregon Retirement Savings Program. And that was a mere vision at the time you were the Vice Chair of that committee. And what became of that vision was it became the first state-sponsored retirement savings plan in the United States. And so I want to call out your leadership on that and thank you for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I appreciate
you, sir.
that.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for hearing me. My name is Paul Martin. I'm a humble physician, not used to these legal proceedings, and first I wanted to thank my neighbors for their eloquent testimony and thoughtful consideration, and I wanted to jump on the bandwagon and certainly wholeheartedly agree that the buffer should be retained. From a physician standpoint, we're a family of asthmatics. I would not have moved to Portland from New York and Philly to a house right next to an industrial area if it didn't have that green buffer. Several times, many times, when I drive home from work, as I'm passing through the Alphabet District on Thurman Street, noticed foul air that's had a lot of investigations, as you well know. But I noticed often when I come into my own house in my own neighborhood, that green buffer seems to have repeatedly dissipated to the point I don't even notice it. So losing that would certainly negatively affect myself personally, and as well as my children who have been hospitalized with asthma. And it could quite potentially force us to leave in that regard. And I don't think we'd be the only people with that consideration. Other than that, I'd like to reiterate that ours is a historic neighborhood, over 100 years old, and I think removing that buffer zone would also cause a substantial shift to the character of our community, which would not be unfelt by a great many people. And to the enrichment of relatively few. Thank you for your hearing me.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, all three of you. Next three, please.
That's all.
Very good. Colleagues, that concludes our hearing on the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, the Code Reconciliation Project. The oral record is now closed. However, the written record will remain open until Friday, March 23rd at 5 p.m. I would ask my fellow commissioners to propose any other amendments that they may have based on today's conversation by April 4th, 2018. We'll come back, as stated previously, on Wednesday, April 11th, to deliberate and vote on any additional amendments. Commissioner Fritz.
Yeah, could I just ask Alf a question on the record so that we all have the benefit of you hearing your answer?
Come on up.
We have heard a lot on the buffer issue on a particular site, but now I'm more concerned about it in general. What's the comprehensive plan policy that this is intended to implement?
There are policies related to buffering between different uses. So in general, the buffer overlay or the substitute regulations would be implementing those. It's generally policy that we have some kind of effort to buffer those uses when they're abutting.
So if you could, when you give me the memo that compares that Mr. Beebe had that showed, what's proposed, if you could also give me a summary of what are the comprehensive plan policies that we're implementing, because clearly the zoning code is intended to implement the comprehensive plan, so we need to know what both of those are. Sure. And then
Correct.
I would also like some guidance as to is there an option of just saying don't do anything on buffers, leave them all there?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, we gave you quite a few pages of code, and this particular issue is the enduring issue. So we obviously have not resolved that or done enough to resolve that. So I think going forward, we will obviously try to provide some more information. Options beyond that, I think you could choose to modify the regulations that we've proposed further, or we could decide to set aside the buffer question and come back to it at another time. So all those are options.
Because one of the options is just to leave it as is, right? Leave it as mapped.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate the clarification.
Very good. So I'd like to remind everybody that this particular project, what we discussed today, is one of several actions we're taking this month to ensure a smooth transition to the comprehensive plan. It's important that this go into effect in May as scheduled. The plan provides the entitlements needed to support new housing and jobs. And there are projects waiting to take advantage of the new zoning, and our actions help provide more certainty for private investments, especially projects that will add to the housing supply. Barry, you want to come up and tell us about next steps, and then we're done.
Great, thanks, Mayor Wheeler. I think I don't have my cheat sheet with me, but we're going to do this from memory, and I think we'll be pretty much on target. So as was discussed before, we're asking for council members that want to propose amendments to do so by the 4th of April so that we get those in the record and have a chance to work with you. And we offer to work with you on crafting those if you have questions about any of them that you want to work with us on. I believe we're coming back on the 11th of April, and I'm not sure, I'm looking over at Sue if we have a time certain on that already.
We have 3:30 scheduled for both the transportation system plan and the code reconciliation.
Okay, so we'll be back at 3:30 on April 11th, and then I believe we have another session to put together a substitute ordinance with all of the amendments in it towards the end of April. I believe the date of that is April 25th, and then we will be coming back in May for your second reading of this ordinance. I think it's on May 24th.
No, it's on May 9th, and it could move to a final reading on the 24th.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, I don't have my cheat sheet with me.
No worries.
Right.
I've got it here.
So that's the lineup of what we see coming forward, and we will get you more information on buffer options over the coming couple weeks.
Fantastic. Colleagues, anything else?
Thank you very much.
Believe it or not, we are adjourned.